stone circles standing silent against mist-covered moors, ancient tombs holding secrets of forgotten ancestors, and the gentle whispers of a revolution that changed humanity forever. This is the story of Neolithic Britain, when farming first touched these islands and transformed not just the landscape, but the very soul of human existence here. Around 6,000 years ago, something extraordinary began to unfold across the British Isles. The ancient wildwood that had dominated these lands since the ice retreated was about to witness a transformation so profound that its echoes would shape every generation that followed. This wasn't a sudden invasion or a dramatic conquest, but rather a gentle tide of change that washed across Britain's shores, carrying with it seeds, livestock, and most importantly, new ways of understanding the world. The story of Neolithic Britain begins not with grand monuments or mysterious rituals, though these would come in time, but with something far more fundamental. It begins with the first farmers who looked at the wild landscape and saw not just a place to hunt and gather, but a canvas upon which they could paint their own survival. These pioneers brought with them knowledge that had been developing for thousands of years in distant lands, knowledge that had travelled along ancient pathways from the fertile crescents of the Near East, through the river valleys of continental Europe, and finally across the waters that separated Britain from the mainland. When we speak of the Neolithic, we're speaking of the New Stone Age, a time when polished stone tools replaced the chipped implements of earlier periods. But this technical definition barely scratches the surface of what this era truly represented. The Neolithic was nothing less than humanity's first great experiment in controlling nature, in bending the world to human will rather than simply existing within its rhythms. In Britain, this experiment would produce some of the most enigmatic and awe-inspiring monuments ever created by human hands. The landscape these first farmers encountered was vastly different from the Britain we know today. Dense forests of oak, elm, hazel, and lime stretched from coast to coast, broken only by rivers, marshes, and the occasional natural clearing. The climate was warmer and wetter than today, what scientists call the Atlantic period, when temperatures were perhaps 2 degrees higher than modern times. This warmth created an environment where both wild resources and introduced crops could flourish, setting the stage for the agricultural revolution that was about to unfold. But before we delve deeper into this transformation, we must understand that Britain wasn't an empty stage waiting for farmers to arrive. For thousands of years, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had called these islands home. These weren't primitive people scratching out a meagre existence, but sophisticated communities with deep knowledge of their environment, complex social structures, and rich spiritual lives. They had developed intricate relationships with the land, following seasonal rounds that took them from coastal camps where they harvested shellfish and hunted seals, to inland forests where they tracked deer and gathered hazelnuts. The transition from this ancient way of life to farming wasn't instantaneous or uniform. Along the coasts of Scotland, in the dense forests of Wales, and across the wetlands of eastern England, different communities experienced this change in different ways and at different speeds. Some groups eagerly adopted farming, while others continued their traditional lifestyles for generations, creating a complex mosaic of old and new ways across the British landscape. What makes the British Neolithic particularly fascinating is how it developed its own unique character, distinct from its continental origins. While the basic elements of farming, wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, and pigs, came from across the water, the way these were integrated into British life was entirely original. The monuments that would rise from British soil, the rituals that would be performed, and the societies that would develop all bore the distinctive stamp of these islands. The arrival of farming in Britain around 4000 BCE marked more than just a change in how people obtained food. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to time itself. Hunter-gatherers lived in cycles, following the eternal rounds of the seasons. Farmers, however, lived in lines, planting seeds with the expectation of future harvests, planning not just for tomorrow, but for generations yet unborn. This new relationship with time would manifest itself most dramatically in the monuments they built, structures designed to last not just years or decades, but millennia. Consider for a moment the audacity of this undertaking. These early farmers arrived on shores that had been separated from continental Europe for thousands of years, since rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age had created the English Channel. They came in small boats, probably skin-covered craft not unlike the currachs still used in Ireland today, bringing with them not just their families, but their entire way of life. They transported cattle and sheep across treacherous waters, carried bags of seed grain that represented their future survival, and most remarkably, maintained these fragile agricultural resources during what must have been a perilous journey. The evidence for this arrival comes from numerous sources. Archaeologists have found the remains of the earliest Neolithic settlements, with their distinctive pottery, polished stone axes, and the bones of domestic animals that had never before existed in Britain. Pollen records show the sudden appearance of cereal grains, and the equally sudden decline of certain tree species as forests were cleared for fields. Perhaps most tellingly, genetic studies of both ancient human remains and modern populations show a significant influx of new people at this time, people whose ancestors had ultimately come from Anatolia and the Near East. Yet this wasn't simply a matter of replacement. The indigenous Mesolithic population didn't simply vanish. Instead, what emerged was a complex process of interaction, adoption, and adaptation. In some places, we find evidence of Mesolithic communities gradually adopting Neolithic practices. In others, we see Neolithic settlers adapting to local conditions and incorporating indigenous knowledge. This mixing created the unique flavour of British Neolithic culture, a blend of ancient and new, local and imported, that would produce some of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. The scale of the transformation these farmers achieved is staggering. Within a few centuries of their arrival, they had cleared substantial portions of the primordial wildwood. They had established a network of settlements connected by trackways and united by shared cultural practices. They had begun the construction of monuments that required the coordinated labour of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, and they had laid the foundations for all the civilizations that would follow in these islands. The tools they used for this transformation were deceptively simple. The polished stone axe, the defining tool of the Neolithic, was their primary instrument for clearing forests and working wood. These axes, often made from specific types of stone quarried from particular locations, were more than just tools. They were traded across vast distances, sometimes hundreds of miles from their source, suggesting they held social and symbolic significance beyond their practical use. An axe made from the greenstone of the Langdale Pikes in Cumbria or the porcelainite of Tivabulioch in Northern Ireland wasn't just a tool, it was a statement of connection, identity and participation in far-reaching exchange networks. The pottery of the early Neolithic tells its own story. The first ceramic vessels to appear in Britain were simple, round-bottomed bowls, often decorated with impressed patterns. These weren't just containers, they represented a revolution in food preparation and storage. For the first time, people could cook soups and stews, store surplus grain, and ferment beverages. The ability to process and store food in new ways was as important to the Neolithic revolution as the growing of crops itself. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about the land itself. To hunter-gatherers, the landscape was a given, a natural phenomenon to be read and understood. To farmers, land became property, something that could be owned, modified, and passed on to descendants. This conceptual shift would have enormous implications, leading to new forms of social organisation, new types of conflict, and new ways of marking and defending territory. The earliest Neolithic houses in Britain give us glimpses into this new way of life. These weren't the temporary shelters of mobile hunter-gatherers, but substantial structures built to last. The rectangular timber houses found at sites like Balbredy in Scotland and Whitehorse Stone in Kent were impressive buildings, sometimes over 20 metres long and 8 metres wide. These weren't just shelters, but statements of permanence, investments in place that declared their builders' intention to stay. Inside these houses, daily life unfolded in ways both familiar and foreign to us. Families gathered around central hearths where food was prepared in ceramic pots and eaten from wooden bowls that rarely survive in the archaeological record. They slept on platforms or floors covered with animal skins and woven materials. They stored their grain in large pottery vessels or specially constructed storage pits. They made clothes from animal skins and possibly from plant fibres, though evidence for textile production in the early Neolithic is scarce. The agricultural cycle governed their year. Spring saw the planting of wheat and barley in fields cleared from the forest. Summer required constant vigilance to protect crops from wild animals and weeds. Autumn brought the crucial harvest when the community's survival for the coming year was secured or imperiled. Winter was a time for craft production, tool maintenance, and the social activities that bound communities together. But this wasn't a life of mere subsistence. From the very beginning, Neolithic Britons engaged in activities that went far beyond simple survival. They created elaborate pottery decorated with complex patterns. They crafted beautiful polished axes that were too fine for everyday use. They built monuments that required enormous investments of labour but provided no obvious practical benefit. These activities tell us that from the very start, the Neolithic in Britain was about more than just farming. It was about creating a new form of human society. The spiritual life of these early farmers was clearly rich and complex, though its details remain largely mysterious to us. The monuments they built, the long barrows, causewayed enclosures, and cursus monuments, speak to beliefs about death, ancestry, and the sacred landscape that we can only partially understand. What is clear is that these beliefs were powerful enough to motivate enormous communal efforts, and that they were shared across wide areas, suggesting the existence of religious or spiritual networks that connected distant communities. The transformation from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic in Britain wasn't a single event, but rather a complex process that unfolded over several centuries. This transition, occurring roughly between 4300 and 3800 BCE, represents one of the most significant changes in British prehistory, yet it remains one of the most debated and mysterious periods in our understanding of the past. To truly appreciate this transition, we must first understand the world that existed before farming arrived. The Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain had developed sophisticated strategies for living in the post-glacial landscape. These weren't people simply surviving on the margins, but communities with rich cultures, complex technologies, and deep spiritual connections to their environment. Sites like Skara in Yorkshire reveal the complexity of Mesolithic life, with evidence of substantial structures, elaborate headdresses made from deer skulls, and sophisticated woodworking techniques that produced everything from boats to walkways across wetlands. The coastal areas of Britain were particularly important during the Mesolithic. Shell middens and massive accumulations of discarded shellfish remains dot the ancient shorelines, particularly in Scotland and along the western coasts. These weren't just rubbish heaps, but monuments to thousands of years of successful adaptation to maritime resources. The Midden at Oronsay in Scotland, for instance, contains evidence of sophisticated seasonal scheduling, with different species of shellfish, fish, and seabirds being exploited at specific times of the year. Inland, Mesolithic groups followed the herds of red deer and wild cattle through the forests, gathered hazelnuts in autumn quantities so vast that their charred remains still turn up in archaeological excavations, and exploited the rich resources of rivers and wetlands. They used microliths, tiny flint blades that could be hafted in groups to create composite tools of remarkable efficiency. Their knowledge of the landscape was encyclopedic, encompassing not just the habits of animals and the locations of resources, but also the spiritual significance of places, the proper times for various activities, and the stories that gave meaning to their world. Into this established world came the first whispers of change. The evidence suggests that knowledge of farming may have arrived before farmers themselves. We find tantalizing hints of this in the form of cereal pollen appearing in environmental records slightly before the first definitive Neolithic settlements. This has led some archaeologists to propose that Mesolithic peoples may have experimented with cultivation, perhaps growing small plots of grain obtained through exchange networks before fully agricultural communities were established. The question of how farming arrived in Britain has been debated for generations. Did farmers arrive en masse, replacing or displacing the indigenous population? Did Mesolithic peoples adopt farming practices through contact with continental communities? Or was it a combination of both processes? Recent genetic studies of ancient DNA have provided some answers while raising new questions. They show a substantial influx of new peoples with ancestry ultimately deriving from Anatolian farmers, but also demonstrate that Mesolithic ancestry persisted, particularly in western areas of Britain. The earliest Neolithic sites in Britain appear almost simultaneously across a wide area, suggesting that once the transition began, it proceeded rapidly. Sites like Windmill Hill in Wiltshire, Hambledon Hill in Dorset, and Island Domnule in the Hebrides all show evidence of Neolithic activity from around 3800 BCE. This widespread appearance has led some archaeologists to speak of a short chronology for the Neolithic transition, with farming spreading across Britain in perhaps just a century or two. But this rapid spread masks considerable regional variation. In some areas, particularly in southern and eastern England, the transition appears to have been relatively swift and complete. Large areas of forest were cleared, substantial settlements were established, and monumental architecture began to appear within a few generations. In other regions, particularly in Scotland and Wales, the process was more gradual and patchy, with Mesolithic ways of life persisting alongside or blending with Neolithic practices for extended periods. The environmental impact of this transition was profound. Pollen records from across Britain show a dramatic decline in tree pollen and a corresponding increase in grasses and cereals beginning around 4000 BCE. This elm decline, as it's known to paleoecologists, was once thought to be caused by disease, but is now generally attributed to human activity. The scale of forest clearance was remarkable. Within a few centuries, landscapes that had been continuously wooded for thousands of years were transformed into mosaics of fields, pastures, and remnant woodland. The tools used for this transformation evolved rapidly. While Mesolithic peoples had used axes, the Neolithic saw the development of specialized implements designed specifically for forest clearance and woodworking. The polished stone axes of the Neolithic weren't just more efficient than their Mesolithic predecessors. They were also more standardized, suggesting specialized production and possibly the emergence of craft specialists. Experimental archaeology has shown that these axes, when hafted properly, were remarkably effective at felling even large trees. The introduction of pottery marked another fundamental change. Mesolithic peoples in Britain hadn't used ceramics, relying instead on containers made from wood, bark, leather, and basketry. The appearance of pottery around 4000 BCE represented not just a new technology, but new ways of preparing, storing, and thinking about food. Early Neolithic pottery, known as carinated bowl tradition, was well made and often decorated, suggesting that these vessels held social and symbolic significance beyond their practical uses. The domestic animals that arrived with farming, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, required new forms of management and new relationships between humans and animals. These weren't wild creatures that could fend for themselves, but dependent beings that required human care and protection. The keeping of livestock necessitated new forms of social organisation, as communities had to cooperate to protect herds from predators, manage breeding, and negotiate access to pastures. The crops grown by early farmers, primarily emmer wheat and hulled barley, were likewise dependent on human intervention. These cereals couldn't compete with native plants without human help in the form of field clearance, planting, weeding, and protection from wild animals. The agricultural cycle imposed its own rhythms on human life, requiring communities to be in specific places at specific times and promoting more sedentary lifestyles. Yet the Mesolithic didn't simply disappear. At sites across Britain, we find evidence of continuity alongside change. Hunting continued to be important, with wild animals making up a significant portion of the diet at many early Neolithic sites. Gathering of wild plants, particularly hazelnuts, remained significant. The seasonal movements that had characterized Mesolithic life continued in modified form, with some communities practicing transhumance, moving their livestock between summer and winter pastures. The persistence of Mesolithic practices is particularly evident in certain regions. In the Hebrides, for instance, sites like Island Domnall show a unique blend of old and new. While the inhabitants kept domestic animals and grew crops, they also extensively exploited marine resources in ways that directly continued Mesolithic traditions. The pottery they made, while technically Neolithic, was used to process marine resources like shellfish, creating a unique fusion of technologies and practices. The question of what happened to the Mesolithic population remains contentious. In some areas, particularly in Ireland, there appears to be a genuine hiatus between the last Mesolithic sites and the first Neolithic ones, suggesting possible population replacement. In other regions, the evidence points to continuity and gradual adoption of new practices. The truth probably varies by region and even by local community, with some areas seeing population replacement, others seeing acculturation, and still others experiencing complex mixtures of both processes. The social implications of the transition were enormous. Mesolithic societies, while complex, were generally egalitarian, with leadership based on skill, knowledge, and achievement rather than inherited status. The Neolithic, with its emphasis on land ownership and agricultural surplus, created the potential for social stratification. While early Neolithic societies in Britain don't show extreme inequality, we begin to see hints of social differentiation in burial practices and in access to exotic materials. The cognitive changes required by this transition were equally profound. Farming requires a different relationship with time than hunting and gathering. Farmers must plan months or even years ahead, storing seed for next year's planting, managing breeding schedules, and maintaining cleared land. This forward-thinking mentality may have contributed to the Neolithic obsession with monumentality, with communities investing enormous effort in structures that would outlast their builders by millennia. The spiritual and religious changes of the transition are harder to trace, but were clearly significant. Mesolithic spiritual practices, insofar as we can reconstruct them, seem to have focused on the natural world, with evidence for the ritual treatment of animal remains and the special significance of natural places. The Neolithic brought new forms of ritual focused on ancestry, agricultural cycles, and the transformation of the landscape through monument building. The role of exchange networks in facilitating the transition cannot be overstated. Even before farming arrived in Britain, Mesolithic communities were connected to continental Europe through exchange networks that moved materials like amber, and possibly ideas and knowledge. These existing connections may have provided the pathways along which agricultural knowledge and materials first travelled. The expansion of these networks in the early Neolithic is evident in the widespread distribution of polished axes from specific sources and in the similarities of pottery styles across large areas. Climate played a crucial role in the timing and nature of the transition. The Atlantic period, with its warm, wet conditions, provided an ideal environment for the spread of agriculture. The forests, while requiring clearance, provided rich soils when burned. The reliable rainfall meant that crops could be grown without irrigation. The mild winters allowed livestock to survive with minimal shelter. Had the climate been different, the transition might have taken a very different form, or perhaps not occurred at all. The story of how farming reached Britain is one of the most remarkable episodes in human prehistory. These pioneers didn't simply walk across dry land. By 4000 BCE, Britain had been an island for over 4,000 years, separated from continental Europe by the waters of what we now call the English Channel and the North Sea. The journey these first farmers undertook was therefore not just a migration, but a maritime adventure that required planning, courage, and sophisticated knowledge of boat building and navigation. The evidence suggests that the first farmers came from multiple directions and probably in multiple waves. Genetic studies indicate that the ultimate origins of these peoples lay in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where agriculture had first developed thousands of years earlier. From there, farming had spread across Europe along two main routes, through the Balkans and up the Danube Valley into Central Europe, and along the Mediterranean coast to Iberia and southern France. Both of these streams of agricultural expansion eventually reached the shores facing Britain. The most likely immediate origins of Britain's first farmers were the Neolithic communities of northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These groups, part of what archaeologists call the linear band ceramic, or LBK culture, and its successors, had been farming in continental Europe for centuries before making the crossing to Britain. They had developed agricultural techniques suited to the temperate forests of northern Europe, experience that would prove invaluable in the British landscape. The boats they used for this crossing were probably not dramatically different from those used by Mesolithic peoples, but the challenge they faced was far greater. While Mesolithic seafarers had transported small groups and their immediate possessions, the Neolithic colonizers needed to transport entire communities along with their livestock, seed grain, and the tools necessary to establish farms in a new land. Experimental archaeology suggests that the boats were probably skin-covered frames, similar to Irish curraghs or Inuit umiaks, vessels capable of carrying substantial loads, while remaining light enough to be paddled or possibly sailed across the channel. The logistics of transporting cattle across the sea particularly captures the imagination. These animals, essential to the Neolithic economy, would have been difficult and dangerous cargo. They required fresh water during the journey, took up substantial space, and could easily panic and capsize a boat. Yet the early appearance of cattle at Neolithic sites across Britain shows that somehow these first farmers managed this feat repeatedly and successfully. Some archaeologists have suggested that young calves might have been transported more easily than adult animals, though this would have required careful timing to ensure the animals were old enough to survive the journey, but young enough to manage. The crossing points were probably determined by a combination of factors, including distance, currents, and the presence of suitable landing sites. The shortest crossing, from Calais to Dover, is about 21 miles, but the strong currents in this area would have made it treacherous for primitive boats. More likely routes include from the Cotentin Peninsula to the central south coast of England, or from Belgium and the Netherlands to East Anglia. The discovery of early Neolithic sites clustered in these arrival zones supports these proposed routes. Once they arrived, these first farmers faced the monumental task of establishing agriculture in a landscape that had never known farming. The Britain they encountered was almost entirely forested, with massive oaks, elms, limes, and other trees creating a canopy so dense that little light reached the forest floor. The only open areas were wetlands, river valleys, and perhaps some coastal zones maintained by grazing and browsing by wild animals. Creating fields in this environment required enormous effort. The process of forest clearance began almost immediately upon arrival. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources. Pollen records show dramatic decreases in tree pollen and corresponding increases in grasses and cereals. Charcoal layers in soil profiles indicate extensive burning, and at archaeological sites we find the tools of clearance, axes, adzes, and evidence of systematic woodland management. The scale of this clearance was remarkable. Within a few generations, substantial areas had been transformed from forest to farmland. The method of clearance probably varied depending on local conditions and immediate needs. In some cases, trees were felled and burned in place, a technique known as slash and burn or swidden agriculture. This not only cleared the land, but also enriched the soil with ash, providing nutrients for crops. In other cases, trees might have been ring-barked, killing them slowly and allowing light to reach the ground, while the dead trees still stood. Some areas might have been cleared more selectively, with useful trees retained for construction timber, firewood, or fodder. The first fields were probably small, irregular plots carved out of the forest wherever conditions were suitable. These early farmers looked for well-drained soils, gentle slopes, and proximity to water sources. They avoided heavy clay soils that were difficult to work with primitive tools and poorly drained areas where crops would rot. The light, easily worked soils of river terraces and chalk downlands were particularly favoured, which explains the concentration of early Neolithic sites in areas like Wessex and the Thames Valley. The crops they grew were varieties developed over millennia in the Near East and adapted through centuries of cultivation in Europe. Emmer wheat was the primary cereal, a hulled wheat that required additional processing to remove the tough glooms but was hardy and reliable. Hulled barley was also important, particularly in areas with poorer soils or less reliable climate. These cereals were probably grown in small plots that were intensively managed, with careful weeding and protection from wild animals. The agricultural techniques employed were sophisticated despite the simple tools available. Fields were probably prepared using digging sticks and simple adze, primitive ploughs that scratched the soil surface rather than turning it over. Seeds were broadcast by hand, and then perhaps covered by dragging branches across the field. During the growing season, crops required protection from deer, wild boar and birds, probably involving the construction of fences or the posting of guards. The livestock brought by these first farmers included cattle, sheep, goats and pigs, each with their own requirements and contributions to the farming economy. Cattle were perhaps the most important, providing not just meat and milk, but also traction for ploughing and transportation. The early Neolithic cattle were smaller than modern breeds, standing perhaps 1.2 metres at the shoulder, but they were hardy animals capable of surviving on rough fodder and defending themselves against predators. Sheep and goats, often difficult to distinguish in the archaeological record, provided meat, milk, and probably wool, though the development of woolly sheep was still in progress during the early Neolithic. These animals were easier to manage than cattle and could thrive on poorer pasture, making them valuable in marginal areas. Pigs, descendants of European wild boar, were particularly important in wooded areas where they could forage for acorns and other forest foods, requiring minimal human input while providing a reliable source of meat. The management of these animals required new forms of social organisation. Decisions had to be made about breeding, about access to pastures, about the protection of herds from predators. These decisions couldn't be made by individuals, but required community cooperation, and probably the development of new forms of leadership and social structure. The person who understood cattle diseases, who could predict weather patterns, or who knew the best pastures would have held valuable knowledge that translated into social status. The daily life of these first farmers followed rhythms unknown to their Mesolithic predecessors. The agricultural year imposed its own schedule, ploughing and planting in spring, weeding and protecting crops through summer, harvesting in late summer and autumn, and processing and storing food through winter. Each season brought its own tasks and challenges, from lambing in spring to haymaking in summer, to the crucial grain harvest that would determine whether the community would thrive or struggle through the coming year. The settlements established by these first farmers varied considerably in size and permanence. Some were substantial villages with multiple houses, while others were isolated farmsteads. The houses themselves were typically rectangular timber structures, a dramatic departure from the circular dwellings often favoured by Mesolithic peoples. These rectangular houses, sometimes called longhouses, though they were generally smaller than their continental counterparts, were probably home to extended families. The construction of these houses required sophisticated woodworking skills. Large oak posts formed the main structural supports, with walls of wattle and daub, woven branches covered with a mixture of clay, straw and dung. Roofs were probably thatched with straw or reeds. Inside, the space was divided into areas for different activities: sleeping, food preparation, storage, and possibly even livestock housing during severe weather. Central hearths provided warmth and light, their smoke eventually finding its way out through the thatch. The material culture of these first farmers reveals both their connections to continental traditions and their adaptations to British conditions. The pottery they made, while clearly related to continental styles, quickly developed distinctive British characteristics. The carinated bowl tradition, named for the sharp angle or carination in the vessel profile, became widespread across Britain, but with regional variations that suggest local pottery-making traditions were quickly established. These pots weren't just functional objects, but carried social and symbolic meanings. The decoration, often impressed or incised patterns, may have indicated group identity or special purposes. Some vessels were clearly too fine for everyday use, and may have been reserved for special occasions or ritual activities. The effort invested in making and decorating pottery speaks to its importance beyond mere function. The stone tools of the first farmers show similar patterns of tradition and innovation. While the basic forms, polished axes, scrapers, arrowheads, were familiar from continental contexts, British Neolithic peoples quickly began exploiting local stone sources and developing regional styles. The greenstone axes from the Lake District, the porcelainite axes from Northern Ireland, and the flint axes from the South Downs each had their own distinctive characteristics. The exchange networks that distributed these axes and other materials were established remarkably quickly. Within a few generations of the first farmers' arrival, we find Lake District axes in Wessex, Yorkshire flint on the Scottish coast, and pottery styles shared across hundreds of miles. These networks didn't just move objects, but also ideas, innovations, and probably people, creating a shared Neolithic culture across Britain while maintaining regional distinctiveness. The establishment of farming in Britain led to the development of new forms of community organisation and settlement patterns that would fundamentally reshape the social landscape of these islands. The early Neolithic period, roughly from 4000 to 3500 BCE, saw the emergence of diverse settlement types, from isolated farmsteads to substantial villages, each reflecting different solutions to the challenges of agricultural life in the British landscape. The most striking feature of early Neolithic settlements was their diversity. Unlike the relatively standardised longhouse settlements of continental Europe, British Neolithic communities developed a wide variety of dwelling types and settlement layouts. This diversity probably reflects both the varied landscapes of Britain and the mixing of different cultural traditions as farming spread across the islands. Some communities built substantial rectangular houses reminiscent of continental traditions, while others constructed smaller, more ephemeral structures that have left barely any archaeological trace. One of the best preserved examples of an early Neolithic settlement comes from Cnap of Howard in Orkney, where two stone-built houses dating to around 3700 BCE have survived remarkably intact. These structures, built of local flagstone with walls still standing to roof height in places, provide an exceptional window into Neolithic domestic life. The houses were connected by a low passage and divided internally into separate rooms, with stone furniture, including cupboards and benches, built into the walls. The larger house contained a hearth and evidence of food preparation, while the smaller structure seems to have been used for storage and craft activities. The preservation at Cnap of Howard is exceptional because of the use of stone, but most early Neolithic houses in Britain were built of timber and have left only subtle traces in the archaeological record. These traces, patterns of post holes, beam slots, and occupation deposits require careful excavation and interpretation to reconstruct the original structures. At sites like Lismore Fields in Derbyshire and Whitehorse Stone in Kent, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of substantial timber buildings that would have dominated the landscape in their time. The Lismore Fields settlement, dating to around 3800 BCE, consisted of at least two large rectangular buildings, each about 14 metres long and 7 metres wide. These structures were built using massive oak posts, some over half a metre in diameter, indicating access to substantial timber resources and the labour force necessary to fell, transport, and erect such massive timbers. The buildings were probably home to extended families or multiple households, with internal divisions creating separate spaces for different activities or family groups. The social organisation of these early communities remains a subject of considerable debate among archaeologists. The size and construction of houses, like those at Lismore Fields, suggest cooperative labour beyond the capacity of a single nuclear family. The felling of large trees, the preparation of timbers, and the construction of buildings would have required coordinated group efforts, implying some form of leadership or organisational structure. Yet there's little evidence for marked social hierarchy in these early settlements. Houses tend to be similar in size and construction, and burial practices don't show the extreme differentiation that would characterise later periods. The daily routines of life in these settlements followed patterns that would have seemed both familiar and foreign to modern observers. Each morning, families would have awakened in dark interiors, the only light coming from the dying embers of the previous night's fire, and perhaps thin rays filtering through smoke holes in the roof. The first task would be to revive the fire, not just for warmth but for the countless activities that depended on it. Cooking, lighting, tool making, and the social gatherings that reinforced community bonds. Food preparation was a constant activity that occupied much of each day. Grain had to be processed from its stored state into edible form, a labour-intensive process that began with removing the hulls from emmer wheat or barley. This was probably done by pounding the grain in wooden mortars or grinding it between stones. The resulting grain then had to be ground into flour using saddle querns, flat stones on which grain was crushed using a smaller rubbing stone. This grinding was hard physical work that probably fell mainly to women, whose arm and shoulder bones often show the characteristic wear patterns of repetitive grinding motions. The flour produced by this laborious process could be used in various ways. It might be mixed with water or milk to make porridge, a staple food that could be varied with the addition of herbs, vegetables, or meat. Bread was probably also made, though without built ovens it would have been in the form of flat cakes baked on hot stones beside the fire, or possibly in covered clay vessels placed in the embers. Pottery vessels allowed for the preparation of stews and soups, slow-cooked mixtures that could make tough meat tender and extract maximum nutrition from bones and vegetables. The diet of early Neolithic communities was more varied than we might expect. While cereals formed the staple, they were supplemented with a wide range of other foods. Domestic animals provided meat, with cattle being particularly important. The age profiles of cattle bones from archaeological sites suggest that many animals were kept primarily for meat, being slaughtered at the optimal age for meat production. However, some older females are also found, indicating that milk production was also important, though probably not as central to the economy as it would become in later periods. Wild resources continued to play a significant role in the diet. Hazelnuts were gathered in enormous quantities, providing a storable source of protein and fat that could sustain communities through lean times. Wild fruits like blackberries, sloes, and crab apples added variety and essential vitamins to the diet. Hunting, while less important than in the Mesolithic, still contributed deer, wild boar, and various birds to the menu. This mixed economy provided resilience. If crops failed or livestock died, communities could fall back on wild resources. Water procurement was a daily necessity that shaped settlement location and routine activities. Most early Neolithic settlements were located near reliable water sources, springs, streams, or rivers. Water was needed not just for drinking, but for cooking, pottery production, animal husbandry, and various craft activities. The carrying of water, probably in ceramic vessels or skin bags, would have been a regular task, likely assigned to younger members of the community. The organisation of space within settlements reveals much about social relationships and daily activities. Houses were typically surrounded by working areas where various crafts were pursued. Flint knapping debris indicates areas where tools were manufactured and maintained. Concentrations of pottery fragments and fired clay suggest ceramic production zones. Quern stones and grinding equipment mark food processing areas. These activity areas were probably used by multiple households, fostering cooperation and social interaction. Storage was a crucial concern for these agricultural communities. Grain needed to be kept dry and protected from rodents and insects. Various storage methods were employed, from large ceramic vessels to underground pits lined with wickerwork or clay. Some settlements show evidence of raised granaries, structures built on posts to keep stored grain away from ground moisture and pests. The ability to store surplus production was fundamental to the Neolithic way of life, allowing communities to survive through winter and poor harvests. The keeping of livestock required its own infrastructure and daily routines. Cattle, sheep, and pigs needed to be protected from predators, particularly wolves, which were still common in Neolithic Britain. This probably involved bringing animals into enclosed areas at night, either fenced paddocks or perhaps even into the houses themselves during severe weather. During the day, animals would need to be taken to pasture, a task probably assigned to older children or young adults. The management of breeding, the care of young animals, and the treatment of sick or injured livestock all required specialised knowledge that would have been carefully transmitted through generations. Craft production was an essential part of settlement life. Every community needed to produce its own tools, pottery, textiles, and other necessities. Flint knapping was a skill that most adults probably possessed to some degree, though some individuals would have been recognised as particularly skilled. The production of polished stone axes required even more specialised knowledge, from selecting appropriate stone to the lengthy process of pecking, grinding, and polishing that could take dozens of hours for a single axe. Pottery production was another specialised craft that required detailed knowledge of clay sources, tempering materials, forming techniques, and firing procedures. The consistency of pottery styles within regions suggests that potting traditions were carefully maintained and transmitted, probably through apprenticeship systems, where younger people learned from experienced potters. The firing of pottery, requiring controlled temperatures and conditions, was probably a community event where multiple households would fire their vessels together. Evidence for textile production in the early Neolithic is scarce but significant. Spindle whorls, the weighted discs used to spin thread, appear at some sites, indicating that fibres were being spun into yarn. Whether these fibres came from wool, plant materials like nettle or flax, or both remains uncertain. The production of textiles would have been time-consuming work, from the preparation of fibres through spinning, weaving, or knitting to the creation of finished garments. Social life in these settlements extended beyond mere survival activities. The construction and decoration of pottery, the exchange of polished axes, and the organisation of communal activities all speak to rich social interactions. Feasting appears to have been important, with certain sites showing evidence of large-scale consumption events, where substantial quantities of meat were consumed. These gatherings probably marked important seasonal events, celebrated successful harvests, or cemented social alliances between communities. The treatment of the dead within or near settlements provides insights into beliefs and social structures. In the early Neolithic, burial practices were diverse. Some individuals were buried in simple graves near houses, suggesting a desire to keep the dead close to the living. Others were placed in wooden mortuary structures that were later burned or allowed to decay. Still others may have been exposed to the elements, their bones later gathered and deposited in communal monuments. This diversity of treatment might reflect different social statuses, different causes of death, or different family traditions. Children held a special place in these communities, as evidenced by the care sometimes taken with child burials. At some sites, children were buried with special grave goods, or in particular locations that suggest they were valued members of society, despite their inability to contribute fully to subsistence activities. The high infant mortality rates typical of pre-modern societies meant that death was a familiar presence, but this familiarity didn't diminish the emotional impact of loss. The evidence for violence in early Neolithic settlements is limited but significant. While warfare doesn't appear to have been endemic, there are instances of traumatic injuries on skeletal remains that suggest interpersonal violence did occur. The causewayed enclosures that began to appear in the early Neolithic may have served defensive functions among their other uses, suggesting that communities felt the need for protection. Competition for land, disputes over resources, or conflicts arising from social tensions could all have led to violent confrontations. The relationship between settlements and the wider landscape was complex and multifaceted. Each settlement was connected to a territory that included not just agricultural land, but also woodland for timber and fuel, pastures for grazing, and access to water sources and raw materials like flint or suitable stone for axes. The boundaries of these territories were probably marked in ways that leave little archaeological trace, perhaps by marker stones, distinctive trees, or simply through communal knowledge. Seasonal movements may have been part of the settlement pattern for some communities. While the popular image of Neolithic life involves year-round residence in permanent villages, the evidence suggests a more complex picture. Some settlements show signs of seasonal occupation, perhaps being used only during the agricultural season, while communities moved to different locations for winter. This mobility would have been particularly important for communities practicing pastoralism, moving their herds between summer and winter pastures. The connections between settlements were maintained through various mechanisms. Marriage partnerships would have linked communities with individuals moving between settlements and creating kinship networks that could be called upon in times of need. Exchange networks moved not just objects, but also ideas, innovations, and information about distant events. These connections were vital for small communities, providing social insurance against local disasters and maintaining the genetic diversity necessary for population health. Around 3700 BCE, something remarkable began to happen across southern Britain. Communities that had been focused on the practical matters of farming and survival started to invest enormous labour in creating monuments that served no obvious economic purpose. These causewayed enclosures, among the earliest monuments of the Neolithic, represent the beginning of a tradition of monumental architecture that would culminate in the great stone circles and henges of later periods. Causewayed enclosures are among the most enigmatic monuments of the British Neolithic. Their name comes from their distinctive construction, circuits of ditches interrupted by numerous causeways or gaps, creating a segmented appearance when viewed from above. These weren't continuous defensive barriers, but rather symbolic boundaries that defined special spaces within the landscape. The labour required to dig these ditches with antler picks and wooden shovels was enormous, yet they seem to have been deliberately designed to be permeable, to allow passage rather than prevent it. The first causewayed enclosures appeared in southern England, with sites like Windmill Hill in Wiltshire, Robin Hood's Ball, and Knapp Hill representing some of the earliest examples. From this southern heartland, the tradition spread gradually northward and westward, though it never reached Scotland or Ireland, where different monument traditions developed. By 3400 BCE, dozens of these enclosures had been constructed across southern and central Britain, each representing thousands of person-hours of coordinated labour. Windmill Hill, one of the largest and most thoroughly investigated causewayed enclosures, provides insights into the complexity of these monuments. The enclosure consists of 3 roughly concentric circuits of ditches, the outermost enclosing about 21 acres. The ditches were dug as a series of separate segments, some just a few metres long, others extending for 20 metres or more. Between these segments, the causeways varied from narrow gaps barely wide enough for a single person to broad entrances that could accommodate large groups. The ditches themselves tell a complex story of use and reuse. At Windmill Hill and other sites, excavation has revealed that the ditches weren't simply dug and abandoned, but were the focus of repeated activities over many generations. Layers of deliberately placed deposits include pottery, animal bones, stone tools, and human remains. These weren't casual accumulations of rubbish, but carefully structured depositions that suggest ritual or ceremonial activities. The animal bones found in causewayed enclosure ditches are particularly revealing. At many sites, cattle skulls and other selected bones were deliberately placed in the ditches, sometimes in arrangements that suggest symbolic significance. At Eton in Cambridgeshire, the ditches contain distinct deposits that seem to mirror each other across the enclosure, as if different groups were making parallel offerings in their respective sections. The quantity of animal bones at some sites suggests large-scale feasting, with hundreds of animals consumed in gatherings that must have drawn people from across the region. Human remains in causewayed enclosures present one of the most intriguing aspects of these monuments. These aren't formal burials, but rather scattered bones, often showing signs of complex treatment. Some bones bear cut marks indicating defleshing. Others show evidence of weathering, suggesting exposure before deposition. At Hambledon Hill in Dorset, quantities of human bone were found in the ditches, including skulls that may have been displayed before being deposited. This treatment of human remains suggests complex beliefs about death, ancestry, and the relationship between the living and the dead. The interiors of causewayed enclosures were clearly spaces of special significance, though their exact uses remain debated. Some show evidence of structures, perhaps temporary shelters used during gatherings, or more permanent buildings with ritual functions. At Crickley Hill, in Gloucestershire, the interior contained numerous pits, some containing place deposits similar to those in the ditches. The general scarcity of domestic debris in most enclosure interiors suggests these weren't ordinary settlements, but spaces reserved for special activities. The locations chosen for causewayed enclosures reveal careful consideration of landscape and visibility. Many are situated on hilltops or false crests, positions that would make them visible from considerable distances. This visibility was probably intentional, marking these sites as important places in the mental and spiritual geography of Neolithic communities. The approach to these monuments would have been carefully orchestrated, with the multiple circuits of ditches creating a series of thresholds that had to be crossed to reach the inner sanctum. The construction process itself would have been a significant social event. Creating a causewayed enclosure required mobilizing large work parties, probably drawing people from multiple communities. The organization of this labor would have required leadership, planning, and negotiation between groups. The act of construction may have been as important as the finished monument, creating and reinforcing social bonds between participating communities. Different causewayed enclosures seem to have served different primary functions, though most probably hosted multiple activities. Some, like Windmill Hill, appear to have been primarily gathering places for seasonal festivals or ceremonies. Others, like Crickley Hill and Hambledon Hill, show evidence of defensive features and may have served as refuges during times of conflict. Still others, like Eton, seem to have been primarily ritual sites with little evidence of practical use. The relationship between causewayed enclosures and death is particularly complex. While they weren't primarily burial monuments, the presence of human remains and the evidence for complex mortuary practices suggest that dealing with the dead was one of their functions. The exposure of bodies, the circulation of bones, and the eventual deposition of remains in ditches all point to extended mortuary processes that may have taken years to complete. These practices suggest that the dead remained active members of society for extended periods, their physical remains serving as tangible links to ancestry and tradition. The seasonality of activities at causewayed enclosures can sometimes be determined from the animal bones. At several sites, the age profiles of cattle and pig bones suggest autumn slaughter, indicating gatherings at the end of the agricultural year. These autumn assemblies would have been times for celebrating successful harvests, exchanging surplus produce, arranging marriages, and conducting the communal rituals that maintained social cohesion. The material culture associated with causewayed enclosures includes some of the finest products of Neolithic craftsmanship. Decorated pottery, polished axes from distant sources, and exotic materials like jadeite from the Alps all appear in enclosure contexts. These special objects suggest that enclosures were places where valuable items were displayed, exchanged, and sometimes deliberately destroyed or deposited as offerings. The decline of causewayed enclosures around 3400 BCE marks a significant shift in Neolithic society. Some enclosures were abandoned, their ditches allowed to silt up naturally. Others were deliberately backfilled as if to formally close them. At some sites, the end of use was marked by dramatic events. Hambledon Hill and Crickley Hill both show evidence of burning, possibly indicating violent destruction. The reasons for this widespread abandonment remain unclear, but it coincided with other changes in Neolithic society, including new pottery styles and the beginning of different monument traditions. The legacy of causewayed enclosures extended far beyond their period of active use. Many sites became the focus for later monument construction, with long barrows, round barrows, and even Iron Age hill forts built over or adjacent to Neolithic enclosures. This persistent significance suggests that these places retained their sacred or special character in folk memory long after their original purposes were forgotten. The interpretation of causewayed enclosures has evolved considerably since they were first recognised as a distinct monument type. Early archaeologists, influenced by continental parallels, interpreted them primarily as cattle kraals or defensive settlements. The discovery of human remains led to theories about exposure platforms for the dead. More recently, interpretations have emphasised their role as gathering places, neutral grounds where dispersed communities could come together for various social, economic, and ritual activities. The long barrows of Neolithic Britain stand as some of the most evocative monuments of prehistory, their massive elongated mounds still dominating many hilltops and valleys after nearly 6,000 years. These monuments, built primarily between 3800 and 3400 BCE, represent one of humanity's earliest attempts at monumental architecture in these islands. They speak to us of communities united in purpose, of beliefs about death and ancestry that shaped daily life, and of a spiritual understanding of the landscape that we can only partially comprehend. The tradition of long barrow construction appears to have arrived in Britain fully formed, with clear connections to similar monuments in continental Europe. Yet British long barrows quickly developed their own distinctive characteristics, adapted to local landscapes, building materials, and presumably local beliefs and traditions. The result was a diverse array of monuments that share common principles while displaying remarkable regional variation. At their most basic, long barrows are elongated mounds of earth or stone, typically ranging from 20 to 100 metres in length, though some exceptional examples exceed 120 metres. These mounds usually taper from a broader higher end to a narrower lower tail. At the broader end, most long barrows contain some form of chamber or chambers where human remains were deposited. The scale of these monuments is impressive even today. When newly built, gleaming white with fresh chalk or carefully placed stones, they would have been visible for miles across the landscape. The earthen long barrows of southern and eastern England represent one major tradition. Sites like Fussell's Lodge in Wiltshire, Nutbane in Hampshire, and Haddenham in Cambridgeshire show the typical features of these monuments. The mounds were constructed from material quarried from flanking ditches, which served both as sources of building material and as defining features that emphasised the monument's separation from the surrounding landscape. The ditches at some sites were enormous. At the Beckhampton Road long barrow near Avebury, They were over 3 meters deep. The construction of an earthen long barrow began with the preparation of the ground surface. At many sites, evidence suggests that the area was deliberately cleared of vegetation, sometimes by burning. This clearing created a blank canvas on which the monument would be built, but it may also have had symbolic significance, marking a transformation of the space from the natural to the cultural realm. At some sites, the old ground surface was marked with stakes, posts, or other features that would be sealed beneath the mound, time capsules of the moment of construction. The timber mortuary structures found beneath many earthen long barrows provide crucial insights into Neolithic treatment of the dead. These structures, revealed through careful excavation as patterns of post holes and soil stains, were substantial buildings in their own right. At Nutbane, the mortuary structure was a timber chamber, about 4 meters square, with a pitched roof and possibly multiple rooms. At Haddenham, the structure was an elaborate timber box with a complex entrance arrangement. These mortuary structures weren't built simply to be immediately covered by mounds. Evidence suggests that many stood as independent buildings for extended periods, perhaps years or even decades, before the long barrow was constructed over them. During this time, they served as mortuary houses where bodies were processed, stored, and transformed. The discovery of partially articulated skeletons, isolated bones, and empty spaces where bodies had completely decayed indicates that these structures were repeatedly accessed over time. The stone-chambered long barrows of Western Britain represent a different tradition, though one that shares fundamental concepts with earthen barrows. In areas where suitable stone was available, the Cotswolds, Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland, builders created chambers from massive stones, some weighing many tons. These chambers were then covered with long mounds of stones or earth, creating monuments that combined the durability of stone with the impressive scale of earthen mounds. West Kennet Long Barrow near Avebury is perhaps the most famous example of a stone-chambered tomb. The barrow is about 100 metres long, with a series of chambers at the eastern end, constructed from massive sarsen stones and dry stone walling. The chambers are arranged in a cruciform plan, with a central passage giving access to 4 side chambers and an end chamber. The entire stone structure is only about 12 metres long, a tiny fraction of the total monument, emphasising that the mound itself was as important as the chambers it contained. The process of moving and erecting the massive stones used in these monuments required sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The capstones at West Kennet, some weighing over 20 tons, had to be raised several metres into the air and precisely positioned. This was probably achieved using earth ramps, timber scaffolding, and rope systems, technologies that leave little archaeological trace but must have existed. The organisation of labour for such tasks implies leadership, planning, and the ability to mobilise and feed large work parties. The human remains found in long barrows tell complex stories about Neolithic attitudes toward death and the dead. The number of individuals in barrows varies enormously, from single individuals to over 50 people. At Hazelton North in Gloucestershire, the remains of at least 41 individuals were recovered from the 2 chambers. What's particularly striking is that these weren't complete skeletons, but selected bones, suggesting that bodies were processed elsewhere before certain bones were chosen for deposition in the barrow. The demographic profile of those buried in long barrows is revealing. Men, women, and children are all represented, though not always in proportions that match normal mortality patterns. Some barrows contain predominantly adult males, others show more balanced populations. At some sites there's evidence for family groups, with genetic analysis revealing biological relationships between individuals. This suggests that access to barrow burial may have been restricted to certain lineages or social groups. The treatment of bodies before their bones reached the barrows was complex and varied. Some individuals seem to have been exposed to the elements, their bones showing signs of weathering and gnawing by scavengers. Others were apparently stored in protected environments, arriving at the barrow as partially articulated remains. Still others may have been deliberately defleshed, with cut marks on bones indicating the removal of soft tissues. This variety of treatments might reflect different statuses, different causes of death, or different family traditions. The orientation of long barrows shows striking patterns that suggest astronomical or cosmological significance. Most are aligned roughly east-west, with chambers typically at the eastern higher end. This orientation means that chambers often face the rising sun, particularly at significant times of year like the equinoxes. At some sites the alignment is even more precise. Newgrange in Ireland, though technically a passage grave rather than a long barrow, is famously aligned to allow sunlight to penetrate the chamber at winter solstice. The relationship between long barrows and the surrounding landscape was clearly important to their builders. Many are situated on false crests, positions where they would appear on the skyline when approached from certain directions, but remain hidden from others. This careful positioning created dramatic reveals, moments when the monument would suddenly appear to those approaching along prescribed routes. The visual impact would have been enhanced by the fresh appearance of newly built mounds, their white chalk or carefully selected stones creating a stark contrast with the surrounding vegetation. Long barrows were rarely isolated monuments, but were often part of complex sacred landscapes. Multiple barrows might be built in the same area over several generations, creating linear cemeteries that extended for miles. The Dorset Cursus, a massive linear earthwork over 10 kilometres long, connects multiple long barrows and may have served as a processional route linking these monuments of the dead. Such arrangements suggest that individual barrows were components of larger sacred geographies that structured how people moved through and understood their landscape. The period of use of long barrows extended well beyond their initial construction. Chambers were repeatedly accessed to add new bodies, remove bones, or conduct rituals. At West Kennet, the chambers contained pottery and bones spanning several centuries, indicating continued use long after the initial construction. The final closure of many barrows was marked by deliberate blocking of chambers, often with massive stones or specially selected materials. At West Kennet, the forecourt was filled with a seemingly deliberate mixture of materials, including sarsen boulders, broken pottery, and animal bones. The decline of long barrow construction around 3400 BCE coincided with broader changes in Neolithic society. New forms of monuments, particularly cursus monuments, and the first henges began to appear. Pottery styles changed, with the decorated Peterborough ware replacing the simpler, earlier styles. These changes suggest fundamental shifts in social organisation, religious beliefs, or both. Yet long barrows weren't simply abandoned. Many continue to be respected and avoided, their sanctity preserved even as the societies that built them transformed. The period from approximately 3400 to 3000 BCE witnessed profound changes in British Neolithic society, transformations so significant that archaeologists designate this as the Middle Neolithic, a phase distinct from what came before and what would follow. This was a time of innovation in monument building, changes in pottery traditions, shifts in settlement patterns, and possibly fundamental reorganizations of social structure. The Middle Neolithic saw the construction of massive cursus monuments, the development of new ceramic styles, and the beginning of the tradition of circular monuments that would culminate in the great stone circles of the late Neolithic. The most dramatic innovation of the Middle Neolithic was the cursus monument, enormous linear earthworks that stretched for kilometres across the landscape. The name cursus was coined by the 18th century antiquarian William Stukely, who thought these monuments were Roman racing tracks. We now know they were built over 1,000 years before the Romans arrived in Britain, and their true purpose remains one of the great mysteries of British prehistory. The Dorset cursus, the longest known example, extends for over 10 kilometres across the chalk downlands of Cranbourne Chase. This monument consists of two parallel banks with external ditches creating a corridor about 100 metres wide. The labour investment required to construct such a monument is staggering. It has been estimated that the Dorset cursus required over 500,000 worker hours to complete. This represents either a massive communal effort involving hundreds of people or a smaller workforce labouring for years. The Stonehenge cursus, while shorter at about 3 kilometres, is no less impressive. Running roughly east-west to the north of the later stone circle, this monument was constructed around 3500 BCE, centuries before the first stones were erected at Stonehenge itself. The cursus is aligned on the equinoctial sunset, suggesting astronomical significance. Recent excavations have revealed that the monument was built in segments, possibly by different work gangs, but to an overall unified plan. What were these enormous monuments for? Their sheer scale suggests they weren't simply boundaries or territorial markers. The effort required to build them implies they served important functions that justified the massive labour investment. Various theories have been proposed: processional ways for ritual gatherings, symbolic barriers between the worlds of the living and the dead, or astronomical observation platforms. The association of many cursus monuments with long barrows suggests connections to ancestor veneration and mortuary rituals. The internal features of cursus monuments are generally sparse, suggesting that activities within them involved movement rather than static occupation. At the Stonehenge cursus, geophysical survey has revealed few internal features except for possible timber circles at the eastern end. This emptiness may have been deliberate, creating neutral spaces where different groups could come together without the territorial associations of permanent structures. The construction of cursus monuments required new levels of social organisation. The ability to plan and execute projects on this scale implies leadership structures capable of mobilising and coordinating large workforces. Whether this leadership was temporary, emerging only for the construction project, or represented more permanent social hierarchies remains debated. The monuments themselves may have served to create and reinforce social cohesion, with the act of construction being as important as the finished earthwork. Parallel to these monumental developments, the Middle Neolithic saw significant changes in pottery traditions. The simple bowls of the early Neolithic gave way to more elaborate forms collectively known as Peterborough ware. This tradition, which includes several substyles, Ebbsfleet, Mortlake and Fengate, is characterised by round-bottomed bowls with elaborate decoration. The decoration, created by impressing twisted cord, bird bones or fingernails into the wet clay, covered much of the vessel's surface in complex patterns. The development of Peterborough ware represents more than just changing fashion. The elaborate decoration required additional time and skill to produce, suggesting that pottery was becoming increasingly important as a marker of identity or status. The different substyles have distinct geographical distributions, possibly reflecting regional or tribal identities. The context in which these vessels are found, often in pits with special deposits or at monuments, suggests they were used for more than just domestic purposes. Settlement patterns in the Middle Neolithic show interesting changes from the earlier period. The substantial timber houses of the early Neolithic become less common, replaced by more ephemeral structures that leave slighter archaeological traces. This has led some archaeologists to suggest increasing mobility, with communities moving more frequently rather than maintaining permanent villages. However, this interpretation is controversial, and the apparent absence of houses might reflect changes in building techniques or taphonomic factors rather than real changes in settlement patterns. Where Middle Neolithic settlements have been identified, they show interesting characteristics. At sites like Eton in Cambridgeshire, the settlement area was formerly bounded by a causewayed enclosure, suggesting a new concern with defining domestic space. The material culture from these sites indicates continued mixed farming, with cereals, domestic animals, and wild resources all contributing to the diet. However, there's some evidence for agricultural intensification, with larger fields and more systematic land management. The treatment of the dead underwent significant changes in the Middle Neolithic. The construction of new long barrows largely ceased, though existing monuments continued to be used and respected. Instead, we find more diverse burial practices, including single graves, small cists, and cremations. At some sites, human remains were deposited in pits along with special objects, suggesting new forms of ritual practice. The circulation of human bones, evidenced by isolated skulls and long bones at various sites, continued from the early Neolithic, but may have taken on new meanings. This period also saw the beginning of circular monument construction, a tradition that would dominate the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The earliest henges, circular enclosures with internal ditches and external banks, appeared around 3200 BCE. Sites like Llandagai in North Wales and Balfarg in Scotland show that this new monument form developed across Britain, not just in the traditional core areas of Wessex. These early henges were often associated with timber circles, rings of massive posts that may have supported lintels or stood as independent uprights. At sites like Woodhenge near Stonehenge, multiple concentric rings of posts created complex architectural spaces. The effort required to obtain, transport, and erect these massive timbers was considerable, suggesting that timber circles, like cursus monuments, served important communal functions. The Middle Neolithic also witnessed the development of specialised production sites, particularly for stone axes. The quarries at Great Langdale in the Lake District, Graigueluid in North Wales, and Tiva in Northern Ireland were extensively exploited during this period. These weren't just extraction sites, but places of transformation, where rough stone was worked into finished or nearly finished axes. The distribution of axes from these sources shows extensive exchange networks operating across Britain and into Ireland. Flint extraction also intensified during the Middle Neolithic. At sites like Grimes Graves in Norfolk, miners dug shafts up to 12 metres deep to reach high-quality flint seams. The mining process was dangerous and labour-intensive, requiring specialised knowledge and probably ritual protection. Offerings were sometimes placed in exhausted shafts, including antler picks arranged in special patterns, and even a carved chalk goddess figurine at Grimes Graves. The exchange networks that distributed axes and other materials became increasingly complex during the Middle Neolithic. Objects travelled vast distances. Axes from the Lake District reached Orkney, while pottery styles spread across hundreds of miles. These networks didn't just move objects, but also ideas, innovations, and probably people. Marriage exchanges, seasonal gatherings, and pilgrimage-like journeys to special sites would have created a web of connections across Neolithic Britain. Environmental evidence suggests that the Middle Neolithic saw continued clearance of woodland, with some areas beginning to show signs of soil exhaustion from centuries of cultivation. This may have prompted changes in agricultural strategies, including longer fallow periods, the expansion of cultivation into previously marginal areas, and possibly increased reliance on pastoralism. The pollen record shows increases in grassland species and plants associated with disturbed ground, indicating an increasingly open landscape. Climate may have played a role in Middle Neolithic changes. Some evidence suggests a slight cooling and drying trend beginning around 3200 BCE, though this was subtle compared to later climatic shifts. Any change in temperature or rainfall patterns would have affected agricultural yields and may have prompted adaptations in farming strategies or social organisation. The Middle Neolithic also saw developments in understanding and marking time. The astronomical alignments of cursus monuments and early henges suggest increasing sophistication in observing celestial cycles. This knowledge would have been crucial for agricultural timing, but may also have had religious significance. The ability to predict celestial events like eclipses or the positions of planets would have been a source of power for those who possessed it. The late Neolithic period, spanning roughly from 3000 to 2500 BCE, witnessed the flowering of perhaps the most iconic monuments of British prehistory. The great stone circles and elaborate henge monuments that continue to inspire awe and mystery today. This was the age that produced Stonehenge, Avebury, the Ring of Brodgar, and dozens of other monuments that represent the culmination of thousands of years of Neolithic tradition. These structures weren't just impressive feats of engineering, but were manifestations of complex belief systems, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and social organizations capable of mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale. The tradition of building circular monuments had begun in the Middle Neolithic with timber circles and early henges, but the late Neolithic saw these forms elaborated and monumentalized to extraordinary degrees. The transition from wood to stone as the primary building material marked not just a practical change, but a fundamental shift in how communities thought about permanence, memory, and their relationship with the landscape. Stonehenge, the most famous of all British prehistoric monuments, perfectly exemplifies the complexity and longevity of late Neolithic monument building. The site we see today is the result of over 1,500 years of construction and modification, but its most significant phases belong to the late Neolithic. Around 3000 BCE, the first monument at Stonehenge was constructed, a circular ditch and bank enclosing an area about 100 metres in diameter. Within this enclosure were 56 pits, now known as Aubrey holes, after their 17th century discoverer, which may have held timber posts or standing stones. The Aubrey holes have recently yielded remarkable information about their use. Excavations have revealed that many contained cremated human remains, with at least 64 individuals represented. These weren't casual deposits, but carefully placed burials, some accompanied by artifacts like mace heads that suggest high status. Isotope analysis of the cremated remains indicates that some individuals came from far away, possibly Wales, suggesting Stonehenge served as a burial ground for elite individuals from across Western Britain. Around 2500 BCE, Stonehenge underwent its most dramatic transformation with the arrival of the Sarsen stones. These massive blocks, some weighing over 40 tons, were brought from the Marlborough Downs about 30 kilometres to the north. The effort required to transport these stones is almost incomprehensible. Experimental archaeology suggests that moving a single sarsen would have required hundreds of people, wooden sledges, rollers, and possibly even specially constructed trackways. The stones then had to be shaped using stone hammers, a process that would have taken thousands of hours of skilled labour. The precision with which the sarsens were worked is remarkable. The uprights were carefully shaped to taper toward the top, creating an optical illusion that makes them appear taller and more regular when viewed from ground level. The lintels were curved to follow the circle's circumference and fitted to the uprights using mortise and tenon joints, a woodworking technique translated into stone. This attention to detail suggests that Stonehenge was conceived as a unified architectural vision, not simply an accumulation of stones. But the Sarsens were not the first stones at Stonehenge. Earlier, around 2600 BCE, a collection of smaller stones, known as bluestones, had been brought to the site. These stones, weighing up to 4 tons each, came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of over 250 kilometres. The transportation of these stones, whether by human effort, glacial action, or a combination of both, represents one of the most debated aspects of Stonehenge's construction. Recent geological analysis has confirmed the Preseli origin, and archaeological excavations in Wales have identified quarry sites where the stones were extracted. The arrangement of stones at Stonehenge encoded sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The monument is aligned on the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, with the axis running through the centre of the stone circle, along the avenue and toward the heel stone. This alignment was clearly deliberate and suggests that observations of the sun's annual cycle were central to the monument's purpose. More controversial are claims that Stonehenge could have been used to predict eclipses or track the movements of the moon, though the regular spacing of features, like the Aubrey holes, suggests some form of counting or calendar system. While Stonehenge captures popular imagination, Avebury, 30 kilometres to the north, was in many ways an even more impressive achievement. The Avebury henge and stone circles comprise the largest stone circle in Europe, with an outer circle originally containing about 100 sarsen stones enclosed by a massive ditch and bank. The ditch, cut into solid chalk, was originally over 9 metres deep and 21 metres wide. The material excavated from it was piled to form the outer bank, creating an enclosure over 400 metres in diameter. Within this vast enclosure were 2 smaller stone circles, each about 100 metres in diameter. The southern circle contained a central feature known as the obelisk, a single massive stone over 5 metres high, while the northern circle had an internal rectangle of stones known as the cove, a 3-sided box of massive sarsens that may have been used for ceremonies or observations. The scale of Avebury is difficult to comprehend even when walking among the surviving stones. The original monument, with all its stones standing, would have been overwhelming in its visual impact. The stones at Avebury were deliberately selected for their shapes and textures. Many display natural holes and hollows that give them an almost organic appearance, and there's evidence that specific stones were chosen for specific positions based on their natural characteristics. Some archaeologists have suggested that the stones were selected to represent male and female principals, with tall column-like stones alternating with broad diamond-shaped ones, though this interpretation remains controversial. The construction of Avebury required mobilising resources on an unprecedented scale. It has been estimated that the monument required over 1.5 million worker hours to complete, representing either a massive communal effort or sustained work over many years. The stones, some weighing over 100 tons, had to be dragged from the Marlborough Downs and erected using techniques that we can only partially reconstruct. The social organisation required to conceive, plan, and execute such a project implies complex leadership structures and the ability to support large numbers of workers engaged in non-productive labour. Avebury wasn't an isolated monument but the centre of an elaborate sacred landscape. 2 stone-lined avenues extended from the henge, connecting it to other monuments. The West Kennet Avenue, of which substantial portions survive, ran for over 2 kilometres to another stone circle, known as the Sanctuary on Overton Hill. The Beckhampton Avenue, now largely destroyed, extended westward toward other monuments. These avenues weren't simply paths, but ceremonial ways lined with paired stones. creating processional routes that structured movement through the landscape. The Ring of Brodgar in Orkney represents another regional variation of the stone circle tradition. This monument, originally containing 60 stones in a perfect circle, 104 metres in diameter, stands on a narrow peninsula between two lochs, a location that seems deliberately chosen for its dramatic natural setting. The stones, tall and thin flagstones of local sandstone, create a very different visual effect from the massive sarsens of southern England. The precision of the circle's geometry is remarkable. It forms a perfect circle to within a few centimetres, suggesting sophisticated surveying techniques. Nearby, the Stones of Stennis, another Orkney circle, shows different characteristics. This smaller circle, originally of 12 stones, contained a central hearth-like structure where fires were lit, possibly for ceremonies or offerings. The discovery of grooved ware pottery and animal bones suggests feasting activities. The intervisibility between Brodgar, Stennis and other monuments in the area suggests they functioned as a complex, with different sites serving different ritual or ceremonial purposes. The diversity of stone circles across Britain is remarkable. Castlerigg in the Lake District occupies a natural amphitheatre in the mountains. Its 38 stones arranged in a flattened circle with a rectangular enclosure attached. Long Meg and her daughters in Cumbria consists of 59 stones forming one of the largest circles in Britain, with Long Meg herself, a tall outlier covered in enigmatic carved spirals and rings, standing outside the circle. Each circle seems to reflect local traditions, available materials, and specific landscape settings while participating in broader shared concepts. The question of what activities took place within these circles has fascinated archaeologists and the public alike. The general absence of finds from stone circle interiors suggests they were kept deliberately clean, perhaps as sacred spaces where only specific activities were permitted. Some circles show evidence of cremation deposits, others of carefully placed offerings. At some sites, acoustic properties suggest that sound, whether speech, singing or drumming, may have been important. The hard surfaces and circular arrangements create interesting acoustic effects that amplify and distort sounds in ways that would have seemed magical to prehistoric peoples. The astronomical alignments of stone circles have been extensively studied, though interpretations remain controversial. While some alignments, like Stonehenge's solstice axis, are unquestionable, claims for more complex astronomical functions are debated. What seems clear is that many circles incorporated observations of the sun and moon into their designs, whether for practical agricultural purposes, religious ceremonies, or both. The ability to predict and mark celestial events would have been a source of considerable power for religious specialists. Henges without stone circles were equally important in the late Neolithic landscape. These earthwork enclosures, with their characteristic internal ditch and external bank, seem counterintuitive as defensive structures, leading to interpretations focusing on their role in defining sacred space. The act of digging into the earth and piling it up to create these monuments may have had symbolic significance, perhaps representing the underworld and the sky, or creating a barrier between the sacred interior and the profane exterior. Durrington Walls, near Stonehenge, represents one of the largest and most complex henges. This enormous enclosure, nearly 500 metres in diameter, contained multiple timber circles, including structures with posts over 7 metres tall. Recent excavations have revealed evidence for a substantial settlement within and around the henge, with hundreds of houses dating to around 2500 BCE. This appears to have been a seasonal gathering place, where people came to feast, conduct ceremonies, and participate in the construction of nearby monuments. The evidence from Durrington walls provides crucial insights into the social aspects of monument building. The settlement shows evidence for large-scale feasting, with thousands of pig and cattle bones indicating consumption events involving hundreds or possibly thousands of people. Isotope analysis of the animal bones shows that they came from across Britain, with some pigs raised in Scotland, others in Wales, and others in various parts of England. This suggests that building and using monuments like Stonehenge involved gatherings that drew people from across Britain, creating opportunities for social interaction, exchange, and the reinforcement of shared cultural values. The relationship between henges and water seems to have been important. Many henges are located near rivers or springs, and some incorporated water features into their designs. At Marden Henge in Wiltshire, one of the largest henges in Britain, the River Avon flows through the monument. This association with water might reflect practical needs for large gatherings, but probably also had symbolic significance, with water representing boundaries between worlds or sources of sacred power. The late Neolithic also saw the construction of other types of circular monuments. Timber circles continued to be built, sometimes reaching extraordinary sizes. At Stanton Drew in Somerset, geophysical survey has revealed 9 concentric rings of posts within the stone circles, with the outer ring being over 90 metres in diameter. These timber monuments may have been roofed, creating enormous covered spaces for gatherings or ceremonies, though the engineering challenges of roofing such large structures would have been considerable. While the monuments of Neolithic Britain capture our imagination and dominate the archaeological literature, they represent only special occasions in the lives of the people who built them. The daily experiences of Neolithic peoples, their homes, their work, their food, their relationships, formed the foundation upon which their remarkable cultural achievements were built. Understanding daily life in Neolithic Britain requires us to look beyond the monuments to the settlements, refused deposits, and scattered finds that speak of ordinary activities and routine existence. The homes of late Neolithic peoples varied considerably across Britain, reflecting regional traditions, available materials, and possibly different social organisations. At Skara Brae in Orkney, we have the best preserved Neolithic settlement in Northern Europe, a village of stone-built houses that provides unparalleled insights into domestic life around 3100–2500 BCE. The houses at Skara Brae were semi-subterranean, built into earlier midden deposits that provided insulation and stability. Each house followed a similar plan. A central hearth, box beds on either side, a dresser-like structure opposite the entrance, and storage areas built into the walls. The standardisation of house design at Skara Brae suggests strong social conventions about proper domestic arrangements. The central hearth would have been the focus of family life, providing heat, light, and a cooking facility. The box beds, constructed from stone slabs, would have been filled with heather or straw and covered with furs or textiles to create comfortable sleeping spaces. The dresser structures, with their carefully arranged shelves, may have displayed important objects, perhaps pottery, carved stones, or other items that marked family identity or status. The preservation at Skara Brae allows us to glimpse details usually lost to archaeology. The houses were connected by covered passages, allowing movement between buildings without exposure to Orkney's harsh weather. Each house had sophisticated drainage systems, with stone-lined drains carrying waste away from living areas. Some houses had small cells or chambers that may have served as storage areas or private spaces. The overall impression is of a carefully planned and well-organised community where privacy and communal life were balanced. Elsewhere in Britain, houses were typically built of timber and have left much fainter traces. The late Neolithic settlement at Durrington Walls provides a contrast to Skara Brae. Here, houses were square or rectangular timber structures with central hearths and plank floors. They were arranged in clusters, possibly representing family or kin groups. The houses were relatively small, about 5 metres square, suggesting nuclear family occupation rather than extended households. The presence of different house sizes and elaboration might indicate social differentiation, though this interpretation remains debated. The daily routine of a Neolithic farming family followed rhythms dictated by agricultural cycles, weather, and social obligations. Dawn would see family members rising from their sleeping places, the first task being to revive the fire that had been carefully banked the night before. Fire was precious. Maintaining it required constant attention and suitable fuel. The collection of firewood was a daily necessity that would have taken household members into woodlands to gather dead branches or to manage coppices where wood was deliberately harvested. Food preparation occupied much of each day. Grain stored from the previous harvest needed to be processed for consumption. This involved removing the hulls from emmer wheat or barley, a task probably accomplished by pounding the grain in wooden mortars or rubbing it on stone querns. The dehusked grain then needed to be ground into flour, a labour-intensive process that required hours of work at the quernstone. This grinding was typically done by women, whose arm and shoulder bones often show the characteristic wear patterns of repetitive grinding motions. Cooking in the Neolithic involved various techniques that we can reconstruct from archaeological evidence. Pottery vessels allowed for boiling and stewing, cooking methods that could tenderize tough meat and extract maximum nutrition from bones. Roasting over open fires or in covered pits was another common technique, evidenced by fire-cracked stones and burnt bone deposits. At some sites we find evidence for clay ovens or covered cooking pits that would have allowed for slow cooking or baking. The diet of Neolithic peoples was more varied than we might expect. While cereals provided the staple carbohydrates, they were supplemented with meat from domestic animals, wild game, fish, shellfish, wild plants, fruits, and nuts. At coastal sites, marine resources were extensively exploited. Shell middens show evidence for the collection of limpets, periwinkles, mussels, and oysters. Fish bones, though often poorly preserved, indicate that both shore fishing and deeper water fishing were practiced. The keeping of domestic animals required daily attention. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs each had different requirements and provided different resources. Cattle were particularly valuable, providing not just meat but also milk, blood, hides, and traction for ploughing or transportation. The management of cattle herds required detailed knowledge of breeding cycles, disease prevention, and pasture management. Milking, probably done by women, would have been a twice-daily task during the lactation season. Sheep and goats, while requiring less intensive management than cattle, still needed daily oversight. They had to be protected from predators, guided to appropriate pastures, and monitored for health problems. The development of woolly sheep during the Neolithic revolutionized textile production, though the plucking or shearing of wool was probably a seasonal rather than daily activity. Pigs, more forest-adapted than other domestic animals, may have been allowed to forage semi-freely in woodlands, though they would still have required some management to prevent them from becoming feral or being taken by predators. Craft production was an essential part of daily life. Every household needed tools, and while some items might have been obtained through exchange, basic implements were probably made within the household. Flint knapping, the production of stone tools, was a skill that most adults possessed to some degree. The debris from flint knapping found at settlement sites shows that tools were regularly manufactured and maintained. Simple tools like scrapers and knives could be quickly made, while more complex items like arrowheads or daggers required greater skill and time investment. Pottery production in the late Neolithic shows increasing standardization and possibly specialization. Grooved ware, the characteristic pottery of this period, was made to consistent patterns across wide areas. The pottery was well made, with walls of even thickness and sophisticated decoration. Making pottery required knowledge of clay sources, proper preparation techniques, forming methods, decoration, and firing. The whole process, from collecting clay to finished pot, might take weeks, with various stages requiring specific weather conditions. Textile production, though poorly represented in the archaeological record, was clearly important. Spindle whorls show that fibres were being spun into thread, whether from wool, plant fibres, or both. The thread would then be woven on looms, probably vertical warp-weighted looms of the type known from later periods. The production of textiles was time-consuming. It has been estimated that producing enough cloth for a simple garment would take weeks of spinning and weaving. Woodworking was another essential craft. Houses, furniture, tools, and countless other items were made from wood. The tools used, stone axes, adzes, chisels, and scrapers, required skill to use effectively. Different woods were selected for different purposes: oak for major structural timbers, ash for tool handles, willow for basketry. The knowledge of wood properties, seasoning requirements, and working techniques would have been passed down through generations. Social life extended beyond the household to encompass the wider community. Daily interactions with neighbours would have been constant in settlements like Skara Brae or Durrington Walls. These interactions weren't just social, but involved economic exchanges, labour sharing, and mutual support. The lending of tools, sharing of food during shortages, and cooperation in tasks like house building or harvest would have created complex webs of obligation and reciprocity. Children in Neolithic communities would have been integrated into daily work from an early age. They would have helped with simple tasks like gathering firewood, feeding chickens, or watching younger siblings. As they grew, they would have been taught the skills necessary for adult life. Boys learning hunting, herding, and tool making, girls learning food preparation, textile production, and plant gathering. This gendered division of labour, while not absolute, seems to be reflected in burial goods and skeletal analysis. The elderly, while perhaps unable to perform heavy physical labour, would have been valued for their knowledge and experience. They were the repositories of cultural memory, knowing the stories, songs, and traditions that defined community identity. Their knowledge of weather patterns, animal behaviour, medicinal plants, and countless other subjects would have been crucial for community survival. The careful burial of elderly individuals, sometimes with elaborate grave goods, suggests they were respected members of society. Health and medicine in the Neolithic combined practical knowledge with spiritual beliefs. Skeletal evidence shows that people suffered from various ailments: arthritis from heavy labour, dental problems from gritty flour, infections from injuries. Some conditions were treated successfully. We find well-healed fractures indicating that broken bones were set and allowed to mend. Herbal medicines were probably used, though direct evidence is scarce. Trepanation, the removal of skull portions, was practiced in some cases, possibly for medical or ritual reasons. Personal adornment and identity marking were important aspects of daily life. Beads made from stone, bone, shell, and possibly wood were worn as necklaces or sewn onto clothing. Pins and toggles made from bone or antler served both functional and decorative purposes. Some individuals may have had tattoos or body paint, though such decorations leave no archaeological trace. Hairstyles, clothing styles, and ornaments would have signalled group membership, status, age, and other social information. The final centuries of the Neolithic in Britain roughly 2900 to 2500 BCE, witnessed the emergence and spread of a distinctive cultural phenomenon known as grooved ware. This pottery style and the suite of practices associated with it represents one of the most intriguing developments in British prehistory. Unlike earlier Neolithic traditions that showed clear continental connections, grooved ware appears to have been a purely British innovation, developing first in Orkney before spreading across Britain and Ireland. This indigenous development speaks to the maturity and confidence of British Neolithic society, no longer simply receiving influences from abroad, but creating and exporting its own cultural innovations. Grooved ware pottery is immediately recognisable by its distinctive decoration, geometric patterns of grooves, applied cordons, and incised designs that create complex visual effects. The vessels themselves are typically flat-bottomed, a departure from the round-bottomed tradition of earlier Neolithic pottery. This change in basic form suggests changes in use. Flat-bottomed vessels are more stable on surfaces and may indicate different cooking or serving practices. The pottery comes in a wide range of sizes, from tiny cups to enormous storage vessels, suggesting varied functions within a standardized stylistic tradition. The origins of grooved ware in Orkney around 3200 BCE coincide with the flourishing of the remarkable Neolithic culture of these northern islands. Sites like Skara Brae, Ness of Brodgar, and Barnhouse have yielded the earliest and some of the finest examples of this pottery. The development of this distinctive style in Orkney, rather than in the traditional core areas of southern England, challenges our assumptions about centres and peripheries in prehistoric Britain. The Ness of Brodgar, currently under excavation, is revealing the extraordinary sophistication of Orcadian Neolithic society. This complex of buildings, dating from around 3200 to 2300 BCE, includes some of the largest roofed Neolithic structures known from Britain. Structure 10, the largest building, measures about 25 by 20 metres and had walls over 4 metres thick. The quality of stonework is exceptional, with carefully dressed stones creating smooth wall faces. The buildings were painted with pigments, including red and yellow ochre, creating colourful interiors that must have been visually striking. The finds from the Ness of Brodgar suggest this was a special place, possibly a ceremonial centre or elite residence. Thousands of cattle bones, many from single deposition events, indicate massive feasts. The pottery includes some of the finest grooved ware known, with complex decoration and unusual forms. Carved stone objects, including the famous Brodgar butterfly, a carefully shaped and polished stone of unknown function, speak to the investment of skilled labour in creating special objects. The spread of grooved ware from Orkney to the rest of Britain occurred remarkably quickly. By 2800 BCE, grooved ware was being made and used across Britain, from Wessex to Wales to eastern Scotland. This rapid spread suggests extensive communication networks and possibly population movements. The consistency of the style across this vast area is remarkable. Pottery made in Orkney is stylistically similar to that made in southern England, suggesting strong mechanisms for maintaining cultural traditions. The contexts in which grooved ware is found are particularly interesting. Unlike earlier pottery traditions that appear in both domestic and ceremonial contexts, grooved ware shows strong associations with special places and activities. It's found at henges, stone circles, and timber circles, often in deliberate deposits that suggest ritual deposition. At Durrington Walls, enormous quantities of grooved ware were recovered, much of it from contexts suggesting feasting and ceremonial activities. The association between grooved ware and henges is particularly strong. Almost every excavated henge has yielded grooved ware, and the pottery seems to have been integral to the activities conducted at these monuments. This has led some archaeologists to speak of a grooved ware cultural package that included not just pottery, but also architectural forms, ritual practices, and possibly religious beliefs. Along with grooved ware, we find a distinctive set of artifacts that seem to represent a coherent cultural tradition. These include carved chalk objects, such as the enigmatic chalk drums found at Folkestone in Yorkshire, cylindrical objects covered in complex geometric designs, including faces and spiral patterns. Carved stone balls, found mainly in Scotland, are another element of this tradition. These carefully shaped spheres, often with projecting knobs arranged symmetrically, required considerable skill to produce, but have no obvious function. The symbolism associated with grooved ware culture shows interesting patterns. Spiral motifs appear on pottery, carved stones, and rock art. Circular designs dominate, possibly reflecting the importance of circular monuments in this period. Some researchers have suggested that the geometric patterns on grooved ware encode information, perhaps genealogies, mythologies, or astronomical observations, though such interpretations remain speculative. The economy associated with grooved ware shows some interesting characteristics. There's evidence for increased cattle husbandry, with cattle bones dominating faunal assemblages at many sites. This emphasis on cattle might reflect their importance not just as food sources, but as wealth and status symbols. The large-scale feasting evidenced at sites like Durrington Walls and Ness of Brodgar would have required substantial herds and sophisticated management systems. Pigs also seem to have been particularly important in grooved ware contexts. At Durrington Walls, pig bones outnumber those of cattle, unusual for a Neolithic site. Many of the pigs were slaughtered at around 9 months old, suggesting they were raised specifically for consumption at particular events, possibly winter festivals. The isotope analysis showing that these pigs came from across Britain indicates that people brought animals with them to gatherings, perhaps as contributions to communal feasts. The exploitation of wild resources continued alongside farming. Fishing seems to have been important at some grooved ware sites, with sophisticated techniques, including the use of fish traps and weirs. At the Ness of Brodgar, fish bones and fishing equipment suggest that marine resources supplemented the diet. Hunting of deer and wild boar continued, though whether for subsistence or sport is unclear. The late Neolithic also saw intensification in the production and exchange of prestigious objects. Elaborate flint work, including beautiful ripple-flaked oblique arrowheads and polished flint axes, shows technical mastery that went far beyond functional requirements. These objects were probably status symbols, displaying the skill of the maker and the wealth of the owner. Some were deliberately broken or deposited in special contexts, suggesting they were sacrificed or offered to deities. The production of these elaborate objects implies the existence of craft specialists. While earlier, Neolithic communities probably included skilled individuals who made objects alongside other activities, the late Neolithic shows evidence for people who may have been full-time specialists. The consistency and quality of grooved ware, the skill required to produce carved stone balls or elaborate flint work, and the organisation needed for large-scale monument construction all point toward increasing social differentiation and specialisation. Exchange networks in the late Neolithic reached unprecedented scales. Objects and materials travelled vast distances. Pitch stone from Arran reached Yorkshire, Lake District axes reached Orkney, and pottery styles spread across thousands of square kilometres. These networks weren't just moving objects, but also ideas, technologies, and probably people. Marriage exchanges, fosterage arrangements, and seasonal movements would have created complex webs of connection across Britain. The role of Ireland in these networks is particularly interesting. Grooved ware reached Ireland by around 2800 BCE, where it was adopted and adapted by local communities. The Great Passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, including Newgrange, Knowth and Douth, while belonging to a different monument tradition, show connections to grooved ware culture in their art and associated artefacts. The spirals and geometric patterns carved on the stones at these sites echo motifs found on grooved ware pottery. The end of the Neolithic period saw the arrival of new influences that would transform British society. Around 2500 BCE, a new pottery style appeared, beaker pottery, characterized by distinctive S-profiled vessels, often decorated with horizontal bands of impressed decoration. This pottery was part of a cultural package that included new burial practices, new metalworking technologies, and possibly new populations from continental Europe. The relationship between grooved ware users and beaker users remains one of the most debated topics in British prehistory. At some sites, the two pottery traditions appear together, suggesting coexistence or gradual replacement. At others, there seems to be a sharp break, with beaker material replacing grooved ware abruptly. Recent genetic studies have shown that the arrival of beaker culture was associated with substantial population replacement, with newcomers from continental Europe largely replacing the Neolithic population over just a few centuries. Yet this replacement wasn't complete, and the legacy of grooved ware culture persisted. Monuments continue to be used and modified, suggesting continuity in sacred landscapes. Some ceramic traditions show mixing of grooved ware and beaker elements. Most importantly, the circular monument tradition that was so central to grooved ware culture continued into the Bronze Age, with stone circles and henges being built and used for centuries after the pottery itself disappeared. The arrival of the beaker cultural complex in Britain around 2500 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the Neolithic way of life that had dominated these islands for over 1500 years. This transition, which archaeologists place at the boundary between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, involved not just new technologies and practices but, as recent genetic studies have dramatically revealed, a substantial replacement of population. The story of this transition is one of migration, cultural transformation, and the emergence of new social orders that would shape Britain for millennia to come. Beaker pottery, the defining artefact of this cultural phenomenon, first appeared in Iberia around 2800 BCE and spread across Western and Central Europe over the following centuries. The distinctive vessels, with their S-shaped profiles and zones of decorated and undecorated space, represented more than just a new pottery style. They were part of a package that included new burial practices, new technologies, new crops, and possibly new languages and belief systems. When this package reached Britain around 2500 BCE, it initiated changes that would fundamentally transform society. The genetic revolution in archaeology has provided stunning insights into this transition. Analysis of ancient DNA from British skeletons shows that the arrival of beaker culture was accompanied by massive demographic change. Within a few centuries, about 90% of the British gene pool was replaced by newcomers whose ancestry traced back to the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These people, who had spread across Europe over the preceding millennium, brought with them not just pots but entire populations. This demographic replacement appears even more dramatic when we consider its speed and scale. Britain's Neolithic population, which had been relatively stable for over 1,000 years, was largely replaced within perhaps 300 years. This wasn't necessarily a violent conquest. There's limited evidence for warfare or massacre. Instead, it may have involved a combination of factors. Incoming groups may have had demographic advantages, such as resistance to diseases, higher fertility rates, or superior subsistence strategies. They may also have had social or technological advantages that allowed them to outcompete indigenous populations for resources. The Amesbury archer discovered near Stonehenge provides a window into these newcomers. This man, buried around 2380 BCE, was interred with the richest array of grave goods known from Bronze Age Britain. His burial included 5 beaker pots, copper knives, gold hair ornaments, archers' wrist guards, and dozens of flint tools and arrowheads. Isotope analysis of his teeth revealed that he had grown up in the Alpine region of Central Europe, probably in what is now Switzerland or southern Germany. He had travelled over 1,000 kilometres to reach Britain, bringing with him the knowledge and materials of distant lands. The beaker burial tradition marked a dramatic departure from Neolithic practices. Where Neolithic burials often involved communal tombs and complex treatment of bodies, beaker burials typically featured single individuals in crouched positions in simple grave pits. Males were typically placed on their left sides facing east, females on their right sides facing west. Grave goods were common and often reflected gender distinctions. Males with weapons and tools, females with ornaments and domestic items. This standardization across vast areas of Europe suggests shared belief systems about death, gender, and the afterlife. The grave goods themselves tell us much about beaker society. The pottery vessels, often found in positions suggesting they originally contained food or drink, imply beliefs about provisioning the dead for an afterlife journey. The frequent inclusion of archery equipment, arrowheads, wrist guards, and occasionally preserved bows suggests that hunting or warfare was important to male identity. The presence of the earliest metal objects in many graves indicates access to new technologies and exchange networks. Metalworking was perhaps the most transformative technology introduced during this period. Copper and gold, and later bronze, offered possibilities that stone could never match. Metal could be melted and cast into complex shapes, reworked if damaged, and recycled indefinitely. The knowledge of metalworking, from ore identification through smelting to casting and finishing, represented a complex technological package that required specialized knowledge and equipment. The earliest metalwork in Britain includes simple flat axes, awls, and small ornaments. These were made from copper, often with naturally occurring arsenic that hardened the metal. The copper probably came from Ireland and Wales initially, where native copper could be found. The exploitation of these resources required new forms of organisation, mining expeditions, trade networks to move raw materials and finished products, and specialists who understood the complex processes of metalworking. The social implications of metallurgy were profound. Unlike stone, which was widely available and could be worked by many people, metal required specialized knowledge and access to restricted resources. This created opportunities for social differentiation, with those who controlled metal sources or possessed metalworking knowledge gaining power and prestige. The display of metal objects became a way of signalling status and wealth, creating new forms of social competition. The beaker period also saw changes in agricultural practices. New crops appeared, including bread wheat, which would eventually replace emmer as the primary cereal. New strains of barley were introduced, including varieties better suited to brewing. The possible importance of alcohol in beaker culture has long been noted. The beakers themselves may have been drinking vessels, and the spread of beaker culture has been linked to the control and distribution of alcoholic beverages. Animal husbandry also changed during this period. Horses, which had been absent from Britain since the Ice Age, reappeared, though whether as domestic animals or wild populations is debated. Sheep became increasingly important, possibly reflecting the growing significance of wool production. The management of animals may have become more intensive, with evidence for foddering and shelter that suggests year-round control rather than seasonal herding. Settlement patterns in the Beaker period show interesting changes from the late Neolithic. The large communal gatherings at monuments like Durrington Walls seem to have ended. Instead, we find more dispersed settlement patterns with small farmsteads and hamlets. Round houses, which would become the dominant house form in Bronze Age Britain, began to appear alongside or replacing the rectangular structures of the Neolithic. These round houses, typically 6 to 10 metres in diameter with conical thatched roofs, would remain the standard British house form for over 2,000 years. The treatment of monuments during this transition is particularly revealing. Many Neolithic monuments continue to be used but in different ways. Stonehenge, for example, saw continued modification and use throughout the Beaker period. The famous blue stones were rearranged multiple times, and beaker burials were inserted into the surrounding landscape. This suggests that while the population may have changed, the sacred significance of certain places persisted. Some monuments, however, were deliberately closed or destroyed. At Avebury, many stones were buried or broken during the Beaker period. At other sites, henges were deliberately infilled or timber circles were burned. These acts of closure might represent attempts by incoming populations to neutralise the power of indigenous sacred sites, or perhaps indigenous populations themselves closing their monuments in response to changing circumstances. New monument types also appeared during the Beaker period. Round barrows, much smaller than Neolithic long barrows, and covering single burials, began to proliferate across the landscape. These barrows, often clustered in cemeteries, created new sacred landscapes focused on individual ancestry rather than communal identity. Some of the richest burials known from prehistoric Britain come from these barrows, including the Bush Barrow burial near Stonehenge, with its gold ornaments and elaborate bronze dagger. The question of language change during this period is particularly intriguing. Historical linguists have long argued that the Celtic languages spoken in Britain at the dawn of history must have arrived during prehistory. The massive population replacement associated with the Beaker phenomenon provides a plausible context for such linguistic change. The incoming populations may have spoken early forms of Indo-European languages that would eventually develop into the Celtic languages of the Iron Age. The role of violence in this transition remains debated. While there's no evidence for widespread warfare or massacre, isotope studies suggest increased mobility and possibly instability. Some skeletons show traumatic injuries consistent with interpersonal violence. The emphasis on archery equipment in male burials might reflect not just hunting, but also warfare or the threat of violence. The period may have seen competition between groups for territory and resources, even if this rarely escalated to large-scale conflict. Climate change may have played a role in these transformations. Environmental evidence suggests a shift to cooler, wetter conditions around 2500 BCE. This climatic deterioration may have affected agricultural productivity and prompted changes in subsistence strategies. The incoming Beaker populations, with their different agricultural practices and possibly better adapted crops and animals, may have been better equipped to deal with these changing conditions. The regional variation in how the Beaker transition unfolded is significant. In some areas, particularly in eastern England, the transition seems to have been relatively rapid and complete. In other regions, especially in western and northern Britain, the process was more gradual and complex. In Scotland, native traditions persisted longer, and Beaker influence was more selective. This regional variation suggests that the transition wasn't a single event, but a complex process that played out differently across the landscape. The legacy of the beaker period extended far beyond the use of the pottery itself. The individualized burial tradition, the emphasis on personal ornament and display, the importance of metallurgy, and the dispersed settlement pattern all continued into the Bronze Age proper. The social structures that emerged during this period, possibly including more hierarchical societies with inherited status positions, would shape British society for centuries to come. By around 2200 BCE, beaker pottery itself began to disappear, replaced by new ceramic traditions of the early Bronze Age. But the transformations initiated by the beaker phenomenon were irreversible. The Neolithic world of communal monuments, collective burial, and egalitarian societies had given way to a new order, characterized by individual burial, personal wealth display, and increasing social hierarchy. The Britain that emerged from this transition was fundamentally different from what had come before, setting the stage for the developments of the Bronze and Iron Ages.